Welcome to the wonderful world of wine. We are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. You can find us on our website, thewww.wine, and our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio. Welcome to the wonderful world of wine. How are you, Kim?
I'm doing pretty well, Mark. How about yourself?
Everything is great. And today we have another very special guest. Raymond Blake is joining us all the way from Ireland. How are you, Raymond?
Very well, thank you. And delighted to be talking to you right across the Atlantic.
Thank you. You are our first guest from Ireland. We're very appreciative of your time.
Good.
So for our listeners, Raymond is a very well-known wine author. And to start out, Raymond, can you just give a little background of yourself and your wine story to our listeners?
Sure. People are sometimes horrified when I tell them I first became interested in wine when I was about 10 years of age. But I do stress that I wasn't drinking it. And I still actually have articles that I cut out of magazines back then. I was always fascinated by history. And I knew that there was these bottles of wine that could age, and that, old bottles, old vintages were being discovered maybe from 1945, the end of the Second World War, that sort of thing. So that immediately fascinated me. And then if we fast forward to 10 years or so when I was in college, one of my professors, one of my lecturers was very interested in wine, and I got friendly with him, chatting and talking, that sort of thing. And then I formed a little wine club, and it went on from there and there. And then again, fast forwarding another 10 or so years, I was working as a schoolmaster. I'd worked for a number of years like that, and I just saw an ad in the paper looking for a wine writer for a new magazine here in Ireland. And instead of applying for the job as such, I just wrote to the publisher and I invited him out for dinner. So of course that worked a treat, because he rang me and he said every freeloader in Ireland is looking for this gig, and he said one of them has invited me for dinner, so he says I'll meet you. So one thing led to another there, and I got that gig, and I was then double jobbing really. I was getting up really early in the morning, writing for a couple of hours, going and teaching, and then all through my school holidays I would travel to wine regions all over the world: Argentina, California, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia. And as a consequence of that, actually, that was how I met my wife, because she's a violinist and she was the artistic director and leader of the Irish Chamber Orchestra, and they were going to play in the Barossa Valley Music Festival, a wine where they were playing in the wineries, in the barrel halls of the wineries. And one of their backroom people had the idea that if we could get some publicity from a wine writer rather than just from the classical music side of things. So it was arranged that I should interview her. And the only question I can remember asking her clearly was, "What's your home phone number?" So one thing led to another, and we got married very shortly after that, after a whirlwind romance. And then I actually gave up the teaching because both of us were traveling an awful lot, and it was my wife who suggested we're never going to see one another if something doesn't give. So I gave up the teaching at that stage, and I jumped onto the freelance roller coaster, you might call it, and that was 25 years ago. And so that sort of brings you up to where I am now. I mean, things have developed quite a lot over the years. I do a lot of non-wine writing. I still do a lot of writing, but I call myself a communicator now as well. I've got a couple of events coming up where there's a wine dinner I'm organising that I talk to the chef, I arrange the wines, I introduce the whole thing. I'm doing a corporate event coming up shortly, and then I go back to Burgundy. It's like my second home, where I'm leading a tour of about 16 people, and I lead quite a few tours now. I did one with Harvard University actually there in May, and I've got Harvard booked in again for next year as well. I work in conjunction with a dedicated wine tour company, so I'm like the expert witness from the wine side of things, So it keeps busy. Book writing as well, articles all over the world, whether it's in India or Ireland or the UK or whatever. So quite a varied portfolio of things that I do.
So how did you go from the history of wanting to learn about wine to the actual drinking of it? Do you remember when you got to be a little bit older that you were finally like, oh, now I'm going to start consuming wine?
I'm not sure there was like a Damascene magazine movement as such, but I do remember talking to that professor I was telling you about in college. I mean, he certainly sparked an interest. And then I formed a little wine club with two friends, and we had standing orders paying into a bank account every month. And if you left it for a few months, you could build up fairly quickly. And what we would do was, like, the whole raison for it, as it were, was that we would buy just single bottles of wine, which we could never countenance the purchase of on our own. So we'd buy special bottles of wine. We'd seek out a bottle here, a bottle there, and then we'd have dinners to drink them together and make notes and everything. And I still have my notes from all those things, and the menus and everything, long, elaborate menus and that sort of thing. So that's where it became more, you might say, formalized by forming that small club. And anytime I say to people, forming a club, a wine club with friends is a great way to expand your knowledge. But I always do warn people and say, remember that, you really must make sure that your level of interest and enthusiasm amongst, say, the 6 people, you must make sure that it's at the same level, because if it's not, the thing isn't going to work. Somebody is going to get bored and sort of say, oh, I can't come along this night or whatever, and they're going to slip away from it. So it's a great way to learn, because if you've got 6 people and everybody brings a bottle or something like that, you get an exposure to much more than if you're just getting it yourself. But I would caution people and say, make sure that you're like-minded if you are doing something like that. So it went on from one thing. I mean, I'm an avid reader as well. I mean, I date back far enough to when there were, serious wine lists were produced by big merchants. Now it's all just on a website. But, serious wine lists were maybe produced on a quarterly or biannual basis by big merchants. And I would get these lists, and they were my bedtime reading almost, fairly substantial library of books, which I love, and there's a constant reference for me as well.
So let's talk about your books, Raymond. You actually own a home in Burgundy. You have 2 books on Burgundy, The Winemaking of the Heart of Burgundy and Breakfast in Burgundy.
Yeah.
So what is a common misconception about the wines of Burgundy you may have touched upon in your book?
At the moment, everybody is put off by the fact that the prices for the headline wines are ludicrous, and even though they've softened like this year, even they've softened. But as I say, if the price of a bottle of something like a very special bottle of Musigny or something like that, if it comes down from, say, $15,000 a bottle to $10,000 a bottle, well, that hardly matters to anybody at all, except the person who bought it at 15 and is trying to sell it at 10. But like the normal folk in the street, like, as I say, the price has gone from beyond ludicrous just back to ludicrous, So there is a common misconception, though, that all Burgundy is ridiculously expensive. Now, right at the moment, one of the things I write for is the Hugh Johnson annual pocketbook. I write Burgundy entries for that every year, and I'm starting work on the next one literally this afternoon. And one of the briefs that came from the editor this time was, would you pay particular attention to value? Now, she didn't just mean in Burgundy, just right across the board. She's saying worldwide, people are looking for more value now. They really are maybe struggling a little bit, and maybe not as flush with funds to spend on wine, discretionary spending like that. So I always do say to people, look, you can get value in Burgundy. Move away from the headline wines. And typically, if you go to a very well-regarded producer and buy their entry-level wine, buy their most basic wine. And I often make the point that I think they almost, and I stress almost, take greater pride in that, because it takes more effort to make a really good Aligoté or a basic Chardonnay from Burgundy. If you can't make a great Grand Cru from Chambertin, well, then you're in the wrong business, And they're very proud of their basic entry-level wines. And one thing in Burgundy now, we are entering what I call the Aligoté age. It was the much derided second grape of Burgundy for many years. I would turn my nose up at it, I wrote about it there and said that it's like the adolescent child that grew up, the troublesome child that you could get no good out of. And in the old days, they would add some creme de cassis to make a kir. So the creme de cassis was just sweetening a wine that was far too acidic. It was like razor wire acidity. But as I said, just adding creme de cassis, well, that was like giving sweets to the adolescent child. You're only masking the paper covering over the problem. But now it's much better cared for. It's benefiting from global warming. It's really having a moment, and you can get great value in Aligoté at the moment. You can also get great value if you just move away from the heartland, the Cote d'Or. If you go to the Cote Chalonnaise or go to Beaujolais. Beaujolais, I love good Beaujolais. It's got a really bad rap, a self-inflicted rap because of Beaujolais Nouveau. But if you look beyond Nouveau, you come to wonderful, wonderful wines. The sad thing is that Nouveau has not, I describe Nouveau as being it's a dead end. It's not a slip road to greater delight. And I wish people would just forget about that and start talking about Fleury and Moulin à Vent and all these different, the crew of Beaujolais. So certainly it's not all ludicrously expensive. There's no such thing really as dead cheap Burgundy, but there is definitely good value Burgundy. Now, a second sort of answer to your question there with regard to what might sort of surprise people. I remember a friend saying to me, he said, but it's really just two grapes, isn't it? It's really just Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And can you get, like, is there enough variety and difference there to keep you interested? And I said, oh, yes. Because you see, certainly in Ireland, most people drink wine by grape variety. They choose their Cabernet Sauvignon or their Syrah or whatever it might be. But of course, Burgundy defines wine, and the old world typically defines wine by where it comes from. So it's the ground rather than the grape that gives the wine its identity. And there's no place more wedded to the idea of terroir than Burgundy. And there's nothing more fascinating than going to one cellar and tasting all the wines made by the same winemaker from the same grape, from the same vintage, and just the only difference then is coming from literally the field that they came from. And that's something I constantly emphasize to people. You know, every time I visit Burgundy, I come across another new producer, someone I haven't experienced before, and that keeps me interested the whole time. It's fantastic. So they'd be two common misconceptions that I'm constantly trying to explode, you might say.
So Raymond, you mentioned the Hugh Johnson pocketbook, guidebook. Can you talk a little bit more about what's required for that resource book and a little bit about Hugh Johnson and those guidebook? I think he's someone in the wine world. You've been hearing about these books for years and these guides, but you don't hear much about the person.
Yes. Yeah. Well, again, this goes right back almost to when I first, cut my teeth in wine. I've been buying the Hugh Johnson annual guide for about 40 years, and I have them all here in a drawer in my desk, and it's got a bit bigger. It definitely was a pocketbook back then. It's expanded. It's put on a bit of weight since then. The waistline has spread a little bit, but it's an incredible compendium of knowledge and of fact and opinion that you can rely on. It's not generated by AI, so it's very carefully edited. There's about 30 contributors like myself, and you can rely on it. Hugh Johnson, for me, like, he's the man who I suppose really got me into wine in terms of literature. I mean, nobody has written in my lifetime, better wine prose than he has. It's just so easy to read his writing. His book, The Story of Wine, is a magisterial work. It really is. It came out over 30 years ago now. I suppose he's pretty much retired now. I mean, he's in his late 80s. He still does some writing. His name is still on the book, but it is now edited by a lady, Margaret Rand is her name. She's in charge of it. The book itself, as I said, it really is a compressed essence of the whole wine world. And the challenge every year is, like, when you're trying to compress something into maybe 3 lines, you're trying to get as much, you visited a particular a winemaker, and you think, yeah, they're worthy, say, of their own entry, rather than just being amalgamated into an entry under, say, Chassagne-Montrachet. You might have Chassagne-Montrachet, you'll say something about it in general, and then you might say, look out for the following 8 producers, something like that. But then maybe some year you'll have tasted the wine from one of them, and he's really come on. So then you might say, okay, I'm going to see if I can find room to give that producer their own particular entry under their own name, you see? But then, I mean, the word count is essential. You're watching the whole time as you're doing an entry, and you're clicking on it, and you're looking at the word count, and then you're wondering, is there one word that would cover these 2 words? I mean, you're literally trying to compress it and compress it and and there's all sorts of little abbreviations, and if something is in bold or italics or in color, they all mean something. So it really does compress a lot of information in there, and I love doing it. I really love doing it. I mean, I literally literally started this afternoon, and just, if you see, also, actually, when I say I started this afternoon, I formally started, but it's a year-round thing. Every time I taste a bottle of Burgundy, I make a little note and say, or take a photograph, of course, that you can do that now, and just make a little note and say, yeah, I remember that now when I'm doing the Hugh Johnson. That might just expand something for me or whatever. And then when you're editing, of course, an existing entry and you're trying to maybe add something in and the rest of it, that's when you're watching the word count the whole time to see, can I go a little bit above that, or can I squeeze it back with something else? Say the same thing in 3 words instead of 4, that sort of thing. But it's a great way of keeping on top of things. There's constantly a reason to be out there looking for another little bit of information, or checking another producer who you haven't heard of before, or that sort of thing, So I really enjoy doing that. It's a great gig to have. I think this year is my 5th year doing it. I'm not sure yet. But just with regard to other books, my first book was actually a rowing book. Crew rowing is my sport. But my first wine book was just after we bought the house in Burgundy, nearly 20 years ago now. I immediately started keeping a diary. And after a few years of diary keeping, I said, let's try and turn this into a book. So that was the first book, Breakfast in Burgundy. And that's very sort of casual type of book. It's not a textbook. Whereas my Cote book is a textbook. It's now in a second edition, and it has about 100 producer profiles and chapter on history, chapter on winemaking, that sort of thing, But in the middle, there was another book called Wine Talk, which I wrote during the COVID lockdown. And you're stuck at your desk, you can't travel, you can't go out. What are you going to do? I said, I'll write a book. So that's just a bit of fun. Honest, that was published in New York a few years ago, and it just has chapters on, a chapter on bubbles, and a chapter on Australia, and a chapter on the States, and that sort of thing. But all just fun, like just stories to be read beside the fire with a glass in your hand. It's not a textbook. So, and I love doing that sort of writing as well. I love telling stories, as you've probably already guessed.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark and Kim. We are supported by Franklin Public Radio in Franklin, Massachusetts, and you can find our website at thewww.wine. Our special guest today is author Raymond Blake. You can find him on Instagram at Blake on Wine, and his website is blakeonwine.com. Welcome back to The Wonderful World of Wine. We are Kim and Mark, and we are here today with our special guest, author Raymond Blake, and we were just talking about some of your books and some of the things that you're writing on, and your specialty is Burgundy. So I wanted to ask you, do you feel this particular, hate to use the word sort of weight of responsibility, but this feeling that you are representing this region that is considered by many people in the wine world to be the pinnacle of fine wine? Do you feel like there's very heavy responsibility on your shoulders to present it correctly?
Yeah, I know it's very polite always to say that's a good question, but it really is a very good question. I tell you why. Because I see myself almost like as a conduit between Burgundy and the consumer. I feel like I can sort of stand with a foot in each camp. I can stand in Burgundy and look out, and I can stand outside and look back in. And I try to iron out the sort of the creases in communication, you might say, between winemaker and eventual consumer. I've been to too many events where I'm sitting in the audience, and a winemaker who is a genius in the cellar just isn't able to get the message across, describing the wine or the winemaking, or making too many assumptions that people will sort of just intrinsically know what he's talking about, in the sense that, like, it's in their blood. It's in their DNA. They've grown up with it. But sometimes I'm almost want to jump to my feet and say, could I explain that for you? I know you made the wine, and I couldn't possibly make the wine, but I really do think I could explain that for you better, And that touches on what you've just asked me there, because yes, I think it is a responsibility. Coming the other way, then you can, for instance, say, oh, so-and-so's wines are very expensive now and whatever, but I might know that I'm thinking of, some winemakers, they pose it's almost self-imposed slavery, the work they give themselves in the vineyard, etc. They take no lazy shortcuts. They might, for instance, train their vines higher than normal, which means they can't use the standard tractor, which is called the enjambeur. It looks like a giraffe. It straddles the rows of vines. If you train your vines too high for that, then you have to do much more manual tending of your vines, and that simply takes time. So there are some people who work incredibly hard like that. And I like to get that message across as well. Another thing, a point I feel a little bit strongly about, like I like the idea of, for instance, organic wines. But the point I've made to people here, friends and colleagues, I always say, remember, it is much easier to be an organic or a biodynamic wine drinker than an organic wine maker. I say, it's very easy to point the finger at them and say, oh, why aren't you organic and why aren't you doing this and that? Again, I turn around and I stand in Burgundy and I say, well, there's that small producer, husband and wife, maybe they employ one person, and maybe they're watching the mildew breaking out on their vines in June after a wet and steamy June, and they're looking and saying, will I drop back out of organic certification and will I save my crop so as to pay the loans on the equipment, so as to pay the wages of my workers, so as to pay my children's school fees, or will I stay up here on the moral high ground and hope that God will provide? So, people don't see that. As I say, you're sitting there with your nice glass of Coulini Morache or whatever it is, but you just don't see that struggle. I've been there as well during that sort of late spring, say around April time, when there's the big threat of nighttime frost, and like 15 minutes, a couple of degrees below 0 centigrade might ruin a crop. That's a slight exaggeration, but you see these people there, and they're waking every few minutes at night at 1 a.m. in the morning. They're listening for alarms to go off. They're checking their phones. They're wondering, should they get out there into the vineyards to light they call them the candles. They're like little burners, that sort of thing. So the stress of all that, particularly for a small family producer who are not well resourced, who can't really handle a very bad vintage, that is something that I think you need to communicate. So there can be misunderstandings on both sides. And I do sort of see myself in the middle as something like a conduit for communication. And yeah, I think it does carry a certain degree of responsibility, because you have to try and be true to both sides. You want to, if I see an honest winemaker on one side and a consumer who really wants to get the best out of their wine on the other side, you want to try and make sure they both do the best out of it, you might say.
You mentioned your Wine Talk book, and I thought it was excellent wine writing, excellent read, a lot of things I learned from it. And I had a few questions for Raymond, so I hope you bear with me. In your Vine to Glass chapter, you mentioned how a place is so important to wine. Here in the U.S., where big brands kind of dominate the shelves, how can we educate more on how to identify, as you say, industrial scale vineyard?
To identify the big ones or the small ones?
Yeah, how can people, you mentioned earlier about it's all about the terroir, and that's what makes wine special. But here it just seems like the wine's got a big foot on it, or it's got a duck on it.
I know.
They don't think of that farmer struggling, or that small family vineyard struggling to protect. How can people be educated to understand that there's a big difference?
I mean, we've the big brands here too, but I understand that it's even more so in the States like that. And it's sometimes hard to look past them because they're everywhere, the supermarkets, and they've got incredible distribution and marketing muscle and all that sort of thing. And the only thing I can say really is that if somebody is beginning to get interested like that, find some way of finding out the stories. Now, for instance, you run a wine shop. I always say to people, go to a local wine shop where the person behind the counter, they're invested in it. It's not just product. They may have visited one of the wine regions and decided we will import this wine or we'll stock this wine or whatever. The way I learned was by reading wine lists and by reading wine books, and by then, as I said to you, forming a wine club. And I really would urge people that if you've got the right friends, small circle of friends, that's a good way to go about it. But reading and there's so much information out there, and there's a lot of misinformation too, and a lot of marketing gobbledygook you have to get through. But try and do that. But talk to a local wine merchant. That's a great way. And start to explore a little bit and say, look, I won't go and just buy that big brand again. I mean, I think, for instance, in the state, everyone tends to think of, say, California and Oregon and that sort of thing. Well, the very first wine region in the States that I visited was the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. And it's a magical region. And I was there during the fall, it was just fantastic. And I came across some wonderful wines. I came across some fairly ordinary stuff too, to be honest, And then another region that very few people know about is Long Island. I went out to Sag Harbor in Long Island, and fascinating as well as being to California and that sort of thing. So if you can just look past it, it takes a little bit of effort, of course, as well. There's got to be it's almost a reciprocal thing that the wine will only give back something to you if you've made a bit of an effort to find out the story. And I'm a great believer, as I say, the story, the people and the place, who made the wine, where is it from? Because then it sets it in context. You can find out out a little bit of the history of it and take it on from there. The story, for instance, in state in the Finger Lakes, where it was a guy from Ukraine actually who was used to really severe winters, was able to show them how to tend the vines to survive the winters and that sort of thing. So there's always a story. Of course, I wrote as well about prohibition in the state. One of the paradoxes is that during prohibition, grape production, not wine production, but grape production increased because there were trainloads of grapes crossing from west to east and being sold off in places like Chicago and that. And people were then making wine at home because they were still allowed actually to do that. So there's all sorts of little stories there. But you need to make a little bit of work. You have to make it a little bit of effort. That's what I would suggest.
I want to take little sound bites of the things that you've said and use them in education. Like, see, this is what we've been talking about. Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot about the stories behind wines and how it's so important and how that can be such a great way to grab people's interest. And Mark and I are both wine educators and feel like that is one of the ways to really get your claws into somebody, is not so much just the information, but like these are the things that bring across the passion of the wine. It's not just what it tastes like, but it's the people behind it.
Well, I always say that, Kim, that in a situation like that if you are standing in front of a group of people, I will always try and tell them something that they can't find in a book or on a website or whatever. And I say, look, if you need the facts and figures, if you need to know the residual sugar and pH and all that, you'll be able to find it. I want to tell you something else, maybe that the winemaker smokes like a trooper and curses like a sailor and this sort of thing. And the winery dog bit my ankle when I was there. Set it into context. Yeah. Give it some story. People love stories. People
the personal stuff.
Yeah, they love stories. And I think we need it more than, I think wine is, and not just wine, but alcohol in general. I mean, I think you might well agree. I mean, there's almost like a neo-temperance movement sweeping the world now, And wine has been bundled in with just, it's just alcohol. It's just, it's a big danger. I don't want to in any way underestimate possible dangers of overconsumption. I want to make sure to say that. But at the same time, I wrote an article there recently for the Indian magazine that I write for, Sommelier India. And I just said, wine, are we losing the joy? It seems to me there's a joyless, puritanical view of things. And you say, hold on a second. It's been in our culture for thousands of years. It's formed a major part of many religious ceremonies. There was a period when it was in Europe, for instance, it was the only safe drink because the water might have been contaminated. It was safe and nourishing. There's just so much history there and culture and everything about it. I hate to see wine being demonized. And I think people like yourselves and myself, it's more beholden on us than ever before to push back against this, because it's almost as if a door is closing. A door that was once open is now beginning to be closed. And there's a lot of heated debate, which I don't think it's not so much debate as one side shouting at the other side, saying, oh, you did this. No, I didn't, and that's not really debate. It's not constructive. It doesn't lead any sort of a resolution or anything like that. But more than ever, we need to tell the wine stories. We really do. And not just get buried in facts and figures, but tell the stories, give people a link, a hook, and that they can be interested in,
Exactly. Totally agree. And I want to stay on stories, and I want to yell at Kim because, well, maybe she told me this, Raymond, but I learned that in your book, you had a chapter, as you said earlier, about bubbles. And Kim is the bubbly queen here on the show. She loves her bubbles, been to Champagne many times. She educates on Champagne. And you had a chapter talking about the region, the Champagne region, and how the vineyards are filled with garbage. Now, I heard history of people still walking the vineyards, finding bullets and war items, but I've never heard about the household garbage issue. Are you familiar with this, Kim, with all your travels?
I think the last time that I went there, we had a conversation about it, and there's just like glass bottles and plastic bags and like all sorts of
That's right.
Yeah. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the initially, like historically, it was Parisian garbage was dumped on the vineyards, because back then most of that waste was, could be food waste and could act as, roughly speaking, as fertilizer or compost, that sort of thing. But as the years went by, more and more non-perishable waste ended up in it, as Kim said there, plastic bags or Bic biros, or also I said like the insole of a trainer. I pulled it out of the soil one time, but that practice has stopped. I can't remember when it stopped, but it stopped, it's a fair while ago now, maybe 25 years ago, and it's gradually restoring itself. But historically, the reason it started was that most of the waste back then was biodegradable. You know, it rot away into the soil, and it only really caused a problem and caused, like, I mean, you're talking about, it's jaw dropping. Initially, when you first saw it, you say, what is this? You know, and you kick around with your foot and you say, shit, I don't know what the heck is going on there, you know? But
And you're in like famous vineyards when you're seeing
yeah,
this, like
yeah.
expensive.
Yeah, you know,
Wow.
but it's interesting. Champagne it's a world apart. For instance, like almost all champagne is blended across vintages, which is the exact opposite of what happens in every other French wine region. And some people are now saying that maybe they should do a bit of that, you know, compensate for the really bad vintages. But you're seeing now, I mean, up until quite recently in Champagne, the quality and the style of the wine, it was made in the winery. Like what came in, like there wasn't really much connection back to the ground. The brand style was set, the blending. I mean, I went to a blending exercise one time in Veuve Clicquot, you know, it was fascinating. I mean, they all just, these still basic wines, they all just tasted like lemon juice to me, you know. There's this guy, and he says, here, make up your blend there, you see. And oh, here I go, you see, I make up the blend, you see. And it was fascinating. He then tasted it and he said, he said, you need a bit of this. And then on the back palate, he said, no, it's falling apart on the back palate. We need something else. And he said, now you try it. And of course, it was actually transformed by what he had done to it, you know. I had just been blundering around the place, like like a kid trying to paint with colours, you know, not getting it right at all. So it's interesting to see now the trend in Champagne is much more looking back out towards the vineyards and rating them much more highly, rather than just sort of trouncing them for crop that we then turn into great wine in the winery. So there's much greater respect, and they're taking a much more Burgundian view of the vineyards and what you can get from this slope or that slope or something like that. So I'm a huge fan of Champagne as well. You might as well know that. We spent our honeymoon there, and you know, it's their life after Champagne. You know, that's what I wonder. Can there be life without it? You know.
Apparently, you went to Burgundy, so
yeah. Well, you know, I'm close by, very close by.
that's true. Very true.
No, I love the Champagne region, but it really is a region apart, you know. But it is fascinating to see now. You've got two, I won't say opposing forces there. You've got the big brands, the Veuve Clicquot, that sort of thing that I mentioned, and then you've got the much smaller producers. It's almost like an orchestra compared to a solo player, you know. And you can't really say that one is better than the other. But I think some of the, dare I call them, solo players, for want of a better term, sometimes they're being overrated simply because they're different, you know, and it's new, it's exciting, it's different. But you say, hold on a second, leave that aside for a second and just say, you know, qualitatively assess that wine and see, is it really up to scratch? Some of them are, but some of them aren't. Some of them are just quirky, and, you know, that's their main calling card. And I think a wine needs to be more than just quirky if it is to get an enduring attraction. Like, it might be good for one bottle, but, you know, you want an enduring attraction there. But fascinating. I love Champagne. Absolutely love it. Yeah.
So you've been all over the world and you're talking wine stories. You mentioned something about getting something out of the place rather than a website or a document about. Have you gone someplace that you've read about and were very interested in, only to be totally like disappointed or disgusted what was going on? I mean, you mentioned, like, I'm sure you meet these winemakers that they're crazy smokers or has anything you were so excited that you read about something, but when you got to the place you thought, wow, this isn't anything like someone wrote about? Have you ever had that happen?
It's interesting you should say, yeah. So first of all, I would just say, like, some of the best places to visit was in Australia, and you get the winemaker, and if you can separate them from the PR person and get them speaking, shooting from the hip, it's wonderful, you know. The one thing I would also say about visiting, the one thing that you can't pick up from any other thing is the smell of a place. You know, you just can't, they haven't got the smell coming through yet. So anyway, yes, was there a disappointing? Yes. Spain's most famous wine is Vega Sicilia in Ribera del Duero. And I went to the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona, and I came home with some bottles for our wine club. And I was able to buy them for not an awful lot of money back then in a delicatessen. It's now a very rare wine, you know, which you're paying at least hundreds of dollars a bottle. So eventually our wine club arranged a visit to Vega Sicilia. Well, the welcome there is frosty, let me tell you. I mean, there's what of us, maybe 10 of us. This is another club more recent than my three guys. And, you know, you arrive in a small bus and you tumble off the bus bus, and people, when people get off a bus, someone scatters to the left, someone scatters to the right, and this armed security guard said, "Stop." And as she said stop, she patted the pistol on her hip and said, "Don't go any further." And I said, "Welcome to Vegas, Sicilia." So when you start off a visit like that, it's hard to recover from it, I mean, the wine still is fabulous. I've no hesitation in saying that. But that was not a happy memory.
Wow. They thought you were like a rowdy group, right? They didn't.
Yeah, I mean, we were just bouncing around having fun,
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, no.
The Irish are here.
Yeah, exactly.
Great.
But generally speaking, though, I mean, first of all, I've often said, wine is made in lovely places, which is a nice thing. And then a tongue-in-cheek quip that I say with regard to, the different segments of the drinks industry, be it the spirits or the beer or the wine. I always say you meet a better class of lunatic in the wine business. I mean, I just love the fact you meet these crazy people that just, they're wonderful. And the things they're sometimes are doing, they're just so committed and so devoted to what they're doing. I just love engaging with those people, and I'm fascinated by them. And that's a huge benefit and bonus, and I don't want to see that disappear. I really don't. There's so many lovely places and lovely people and lovely wines around the world. The variety and diversity, I always say that's wine's greatest asset is its, variety and diversity. I mean, I think of, even within France, for instance, I mean, if you shoot from the Loire Valley down to the Languedoc, or if you shoot from Alsace to Bordeaux, or Champagne down to the Rhone Valley, the wines are radically different, absolutely radically different. The winemaking philosophies behind them are different. Everything is different. And that's what makes it so fascinating. You can constantly go and visit these places and come across something new and interesting and different. And now as well, there's much more interchange of ideas, which generally speaking, I think interchange, cross-continental, trans-global, you might say, interchange of ideas, which is generally beneficial. The one thing I don't want it to do is to lead to homogenization across, that everything ends up being made in the same style. I think there was a risk of that happening more at the end of the last century, where, winemaking went back into the winery, you might say, in the sense that there was all this whiz-bang technology, and all this different things you could apply, so much science and that sort of thing could be applied to wine. And it began to make wines taste pretty much the same. It was hard to tell where they were from. Super Tuscan was the best. The Super Tuscan red wines, I think, was the best example of that, because I would taste them and say, this is really an excellent wine, but I wouldn't have a clue where it was from. It's just a wonderful Cabernet-based wine or something like that. But I didn't think it had much taste of its origin. I think that has improved in the last 25 years. I think people have gone back out and respected their vineyards more than they did 25 or 30 years ago. And they realize that that's really where the character is set, as well as the quality, essentially. Yeah.
I liked how you said you don't aim to take the mystery out of wine, because mystery is the fun of wine. Do you still have fun after all these years of writing about wine?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I'm so glad, because I was being interviewed by somebody else recently. He was doing a PhD thesis, doctoral thesis on wine writing. And I said to him, I know he was interviewing people individually. And I said, I'm sure there are people, colleagues of mine, who've said to you that their aim is to take the mystery out of wine. He says, yeah, they all say that. I said, well, they're all wrong. I said, wine without mystery is called water, I said. If you demystify it, you're left with nothing. We should celebrate the mystery. We should celebrate the fact that it is complex. Otherwise I'm not going to... Why have I remained interested in wine for 40 years? If it was simple and easy, I'd have lost interest. But there's always something else. There's always another door about to open, So I'm a huge believer in celebrate the mystery, and don't try and, pin it down and quantify it and just say, now we've got it sorted, we move on to something else. Yeah, that's something I feel quite strongly about, yeah. With regard to, celebrating the fun of wine and everything. This current club that we're in, I've been with these guys for about 25 years now. There's about 12 of us, and we do a dinner in rotation. So we all pay for our meal, and the host provides all the wine for that. So your turn comes around maybe every 18 months or something. I mean, my next one is going to be next January, and I'm already worried about what I'll be serving and everything. First one after the summer. We don't do ones over the summer. I'm already excited about it, because you're there saying, I wonder what wines he'll have and all this sort of thing. And it'll be great to see everyone again and talk about where we'll go next year. We always do an annual trip to a wine region. And like there's never been a falling off of interest there. But the key thing there is everybody is mad about the wine. It's individual people. It's not individuals and their spouses or partners. It's individual people who are absolutely mad about wine. And it's where I've drunk, a huge amount of the best wines because everyone puts their best foot forward. And that, I can't overstate that that's what it's all about. I have loads and loads of bottles here. I would never open them on my own. Never, never, never. I want to open them with somebody who I know will be interested in interacting, even if they're saying I don't like it, because that's possibly, that's
the sharing part of it.
And getting
the camaraderie.
And a greater appreciation of it. Your appreciation of it can then be amplified or corrected as a consequence of that. So wine is there for sharing. It's a wonderful, wonderful bonding exercise. Well,
it kind of is.
Yeah.
My wine group is the same way. So
it can work that way anyway. So I better shut up now.
Oh, thank you. Raymond, thank you very much for your passion, for your writings on wine. We appreciate it. I hope our listeners seek out your books. They can find you on your Instagram at Blake on Wine, your website, blakeonwine.com. We thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mark, and Kim as well. And maybe we'll meet in person someday.
I hope so.
That would
Share
be great.
some of your good wine.
Yes.
Yes.
Some Kim, you bring the champagne.
We'll do some champagne. There we go.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for joining us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We have been your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. Today's special guest has been wine author Raymond Blake. You can find him on Instagram at Blake on Wine, and his website is blakeonwine.com. You can find more information about Kim and I on our website, thewww.wine. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio here in Massachusetts. You can find all our past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes. Cheers.
And cheers from Ireland.
Wine, wine.